Hello and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. In this episode, instead of looking at the past, we're going to try and look ahead and try and draw up a blueprint of what needs to be done to realize the new India, the vision of the new India that the PM spoke about in his Independence Day address. Is it doable? And in just 5 years, what will it take for us to get there? And to help me join the dots are two of the most visionary minds in the country, Mr. N.K. Singh, administrator, economist, politician, truly a man for all seasons, and Sajid Chinoy, whose designation Chief Asia Economist JP Morgan does not do justice to his insightful views on issues way beyond economics. But before we get into a concrete plan of action, let me start by asking both of you in turn that given where we are today, is this promise of a new India, and that too in just 5 years, just some more rhetoric that's not to be taken any more seriously than the lofty promises that we've heard from our leaders in the past? Or is there reason to believe that this time it's different and here is a government that means business? Mr. Singh?
Well, I think that this pronouncement by the Prime Minister for a new India is backed by a very credible action program in terms of where the economic fundamentals are currently designed to take us. We will be growing, hopefully, at 8% plus in the coming years. It would be based on strong macroeconomic fundamentals. It would be based on public investments supported by private investments. It would be supported by an infrastructure, investments in infrastructure and social sector, whose outcomes now we are beginning to see. So I think that the Prime Minister's message must be seen in the context of a whole host of new initiatives which this government has launched. A lot of it is well under implementation, and a lot of it I think we will begin to see positive outcomes over the coming few years.
Sajid, Mr. Singh spoke about a number of initiatives, but surely these are all really works in progress, so that maybe at best one can talk of a better India, a more developed India, etc. But frankly, all this talk of a new India sounds a little over the top to me. Or am I just being a cynical journalist as usual? And is it in the nature of political statements that they must necessarily be a little over the top to make people incentivized, make them encouraged and enthused about the future? Sajid?
You know, Mythili, to start with, I think sometimes we shortchange ourselves. It's a good time to take stock because we're at the 25th year anniversary of the 1991 reforms. And in a way, if you just step back and look through all the noise, what's happened in the last 25 years has been quite remarkable. We've taken growth rates that were in the 3.5% for the first 40 years of independence, you know, up to 5% in the 1980s, to a trajectory now of 7.5%. So I think let's appreciate a lot has been done. And I actually agree that we are at the cusp of something bigger and better here. I think leaders need to be aspirational. They need to galvanize the country, and I think that's what the Prime Minister has done. But again, if you just step back and look at what's been accomplished in the last 24 months, through all the noise of daily markets and movements, the fact is 2016 perhaps saw the most structural reform since 1991. We've had a goods and services tax, we have a bankruptcy law, we have a new monetary policy framework, we've got Aadhaar being operationalized by the day. So a lot has gotten done in the last year, which gives me hope that there is renewed momentum going forward. Of course, the task before us, as we'll discuss I'm sure on the show, is daunting. So there's a lot more that needs to be done, but I see the glass as being half full.
Okay, so clearly I'm in a minority, or maybe I'm just being impatient, the usual cynical journalist. But Mr. Singh, PM Modi's vision of a new India envisaged houses, water, electricity for the poor, doubling farmers' income, giving opportunities to youth and women to fulfill their dreams, an India that's free from terrorism, communalism, casteism, nepotism, corruption, and was also healthy and clean. In short, it was a bit like a motherhood and apple pie statement, but it contained no specific steps of how to get there. Is that only to be expected that Prime Ministers will always speak only in generalities? Mr. Singh?
No, Mythili, I think that that would be excessively cynical, because for each of these components which you have just mentioned, and I agree with Sajid that leaders have to be aspirational, they have to be also in a mode of enthusing people to achieve these somewhat daunting but doable objectives. Because let me just say that even as we speak, Mythili, this afternoon I'll be participating in a panel discussion in the Niti Aayog, which they have arranged for the launch of the 3-year action program. This action program, which I received last night, has a very detailed program on each of these segments which you have mentioned, on the continuation of strong macro fundamentals, on growth being incentivized by a whole lot of structural reforms in the, for instance, in the skills and education sector. It articulates a very robust program of what can be done to improve the educational outcomes, what can be done to improve the current regulatory framework in which the education sector currently faces. So I think that really speaking, if you go through this document, and I went through it hurriedly last night because I have to participate in a panel discussion later this afternoon. This is a document being today released by the finance minister in a major function in the Niti Aayog. Maybe I shouldn't have spoken about it before it is launched, but the fact remains that just as you have spoken, Mythili, each of the items which you mentioned in your brief comments have been dealt with exhaustively and backed by a doable roadmap.
Okay, aspirational or pragmatic? How should leaders be? Sajid, your take. But remember also that there's been no dearth of blueprints in the past as well. And in the end, it all boils down to execution. And that is where we fail and fail abysmally. And though Mr. Singh has spoken about this detailed blueprint, which he's spoken very highly of, and I'm sure it's a very good blueprint, but how do we translate words and speech into action? We've never succeeded really. Sajid?
No, I think one thing that this government has shown unambiguously over the last 2-3 years is that execution and implementation is placed at a very high premium, and they've been able to go into mission mode on various issues. So I'm hoping that intensity goes forward. Now, just to understand the magnitude of the challenge here, we need to be careful about what expectations are. When we were growing at 9% between 2003 and 2008, India's golden era, it came on the back of very strong global growth. Indian exports were growing at 18% a year for 5 years in real terms in that period. Now, in the last 5 years, exports have grown at just 3% a year. So when a sector of the economy that's 20% of GDP experiences a 15 percentage point slowdown, essentially you're subtracting about 200 basis points from headline growth after accounting for the import content of export. So my point is, the task is we've got our task cut ahead. Given where we forecast global growth to be, it's unlikely India is going to get the kind of tailwind we got from the global economy in the mid-2000s, and therefore we'll have to find a way to jumpstart domestic demand, domestic investment, increase the employability of labor, all of this in a much more somber global environment. So the task really is daunting, but I will say that I think the two things that we need to focus on in the next 5 years, which was the start of your first question, is jumpstart the private investment cycle. The big difference today between India in 2017 and 2007 is we haven't seen private investment pick up, and we should discuss how to get there. But I think jumpstarting the private investment cycle, which entails, in my view, cleaning up the banking system and a large public investment trust, along with increasing the employability of labor. I think that is the critical part here, that factor of production has to become more attractive going forward. Those to me are the challenges that this government, I think, it needs to position for in the next 5 years.
Mr. Singh, Sajid spoke about the need to improve corporate investment, but realistically speaking, since all that we can really hope for is faster progress in the next 5 years than in the immediate past, which are the specific areas that you think that we could focus on where we could get maximum bang for the buck, and how do we improve corporate investment?
Well, I think that Sajid has touched on some important components of that. I think to incentivize private investment, I do believe, and not only because the economic survey, part 2, highlights this particular aspect significantly, is to get rid of this legacy problem of the twin balance sheet malaise. And I think every action that we are seeing in the last 1 month, in the coordinated focus by the RBI and the Ministry of Finance, is to resolve this twin balance sheet problem. You will see action in terms of the faster pace at which bankruptcy proceedings are being commenced. We have companies have been identified, and I think that the action is really beginning to see credible progress. We have overcome important legal hurdles in that, and I think that when this begins to really have a demonstrative impact in terms of one or two important notable successes in the course of the next 3 months or so in the resolution of this twin balance sheet, you will not only see NPA numbers coming down significantly as far as banks are concerned, but you will see many corporate balance sheets looking much healthier than they have been, and I think it will rekindle, I think, new green shoots of investment. This is important, coupled with the fact that a lot of other structural measures which have been taken, like very deep reforms of the banking and financial system as we go forward in the bankruptcy, a very deep reform of India's tax reforms with the center and the states beginning to act in concert. The fact that government is now likely to have a majority in the upper house as well will facilitate even difficult legislations. And one thing I'm very clear on, this government is not ducking difficult decisions. It is not really trying to throw the can down the street, whether it comes to deep tax reforms, it comes to bankruptcy reforms, what it intends to go forward in terms of creating job-related manufacturing hubs by having a relook at further liberalization on the factors of production. This government is not ducking difficult decisions. I think that when you add up with where we are currently and the achievements which have been quite significant, particularly in the last 18 months or so, augurs, in my view, well.
Sajid, Mr. Singh is right that this is a government which has been pretty bold in a number of areas, but ultimately any vision of a new India must necessarily entail an India that is growing faster than its present 7% or thereabouts. And ultimately, for faster growth, governments everywhere, including in India, essentially have two levers: monetary, fiscal, apart from what we can loosely call governance, and that of course we'll get into a little later in the program. But of the two main levers, monetary and fiscal, which do you think offers the maximum potential at this particular juncture, and why, in an environment where private investment is not picking up? Sajid?
Mythili, very good question. Before I answer that, let me just kind of completely agree with what Mr. Singh said. I think the way to think about the last 25 years of reforms they've been focused largely on product market reforms, trade liberalization, industrial delicensing, reforming your indirect tax system. Those are all product market reforms, and that's resulted in significant productivity growth, and we've reaped the growth dividends of that. The next 25 years, the next 5 years have to be all about factor market reforms. We have to begin to liberalize our labor markets, our land markets, our credit markets, which means banking. So I think that's the difference. What New India needs to involve or entail is now this renewed thrust on factor market reforms more than product market reforms. To your specific question, you know, the unfortunate reality is that there are no easy hits left. In my view, there is neither much space left on the fiscal front nor on the monetary front. On the fiscal front, you know, the fact is the consolidated fiscal deficit is 6.5% of GDP. Our debt to GDP is, you know, a little below 70%. And given the outlook for nominal GDP, it doesn't take much in terms of fiscal expansion for debt to GDP to begin to rise again. So what I'm going to propose on the fiscal front is not a loosening of the fiscal deficit. In fact, but instead is something a little more radical, which is India needs a good old-fashioned asset swap. Now, what do I mean by that? We clearly need a public investment stimulus. Capital expenditure on the central budget, on state budgets, needs to be meaningfully higher now, especially given the malaise that's afflicted private investment, and given that a lot of public investment happens on the provisioning of public goods for which there are huge positive externalities. Those externalities never get fully internalized by the private sector, and therefore, you know, markets fail and we underprovide these public goods. So these public goods will need to be provided by the center and the state government. The question is, how do you pay for it without expanding your fiscal deficit? And this is where I think, you know, a big push on disinvestment becomes critical. The government of India has lots of assets which are, you know, subpar, not very productive. what you need to see is a sustained effort at disinvestment, privatization, and use those resources and plow them into physical and social infrastructure. So you're not selling the family jewels, all you're doing is a asset swap. You're selling your unproductive assets and plowing those resources into productive public infrastructure. That for me has to be the roadmap going forward, rather than just tinkering with the fiscal deficit for the next few years and living with the consequences of that. And on monetary policy, you know, the fact is we've had a dramatic new framework. I think one of the reasons India is credited with so much macroeconomic stability is we now have a public commitment to 4% inflation, and I think that's the foundation on which future growth will prosper. So there is no traditional fiscal monetary space that exists, which is why I think this government, which has shown a very encouraging tendency to be bold, needs to take the bull by its horns, use disinvestment proceeds to invest in public infrastructure. And the sale of Air India, I think, is a very encouraging early symbolic start.
So we've come a long way, but we still have a long way yet to go. But now it's time for us to slip into a very short break. But please do stay with us, because when we come back, we're going to turn to the most important lever, governance. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and I'm in discussion with Mr. N.K. Singh and Sajid on what is the kind of roadmap that we can have to reach that new India that the Prime Minister spoke about. Mr. Singh, let me now turn to the most difficult question of governance. With your stint in Parliament, would you agree that not only is it very difficult to define, it's also the hardest to tackle? What does better governance really mean? Better law and order, a criminal justice system that delivers, a decent quality of life for every Indian? And how does one really achieve that, Mr. Singh?
Well, I think, Mythili, that I agree with you is a very important aspect of supporting the multiple reform initiatives and the growth strategy of the government, the governance reforms. What does governance reform entails? First and foremost, clearly it entails a greater assurance on security of life and property. It entails really an overhaul of the judicial system, which enables the laws to be observed, contracts to be enforced. It entails really a significant improvement in the ease of doing business, on which some initiatives have begun, but there is a long way to go. It entails much greater partnership between the centre and the states, and I think that this government's initiatives in all these segments have been credible. For instance, I think to take the last one first, a working federal compact between the centre and the states. The GST is one of the most shining examples of that, in which states and the centre both voluntarily vacated areas of sovereignty for what was considered to be the larger good of the economy as a whole. This is the first time it has happened. It has taken nearly 70 years for this to happen. And I think that if this is an example of the way forward on a more workable, a more pragmatic, and a more mutually supporting centre-state compact, it would make a huge difference on the governance. And I think that our parliamentary rules and procedures are locked up in the India of yesterday, and reforming some of these or giving thought to some of these would bring about not only improved superintendence of Parliament over the executive, but will make a decisive difference on the quality of governance. And this equally applies to the working of the state legislatures, which do take a cue from what happens in the central Parliament.
Sajid, I'm sure you'll second much of that, and you're most disheartened to hear that Parliament seems least concerned about how the economy is faring. They don't have time to discuss such issues at all. But if I were to ask you some very specific points that we could do to try and change governance in the country, what would they be? Because I'm hoping that you and Mr. Singh will give me some very definite ideas that are doable and don't just remain simply good but, impractical ideas. Sajid?
Well, let me start by saying I completely agree with Mr. Singh, who's been a veteran of this process and understands how systems work. I'll just say that, I think human beings, institutions, governments respond to incentives. And I think the one point I wanted to underscore that Mr. Singh already raised is I think ultimately governance it will improve endogenously if we were to continue going down this path of competitive fiscal federalism, which is what Mr. Singh alluded to, and that what I think for me, the most encouraging aspect of the last decade has been that we now finally have states competing with each other. You know, a very encouraging statistic, a number of political scientists have found that the probability of state governments getting re-elected was strangely inversely correlated to economic outcomes in the 1980s and 1990s. But over the last 15 or 17 years, good economics has become good politics, which is that the likelihood of a state government increasing its vote share or getting re-elected is very strongly correlated with economic outcomes, per capita growth, inflation management. So I'm very hopeful that as more power and resources are delegated to the states, and states start competing with each other to attract investment, governance will endogenously improve. We're already seeing some states try to amend labor laws. Some states have tried creative things on liberalizing land markets. So I think for me, it's the bottom-up dynamism of states competing with each other and the competition that will drive better outcomes that holds out the hope for improved governance in the coming decades.
Yes, that's entirely right, that the hope of tomorrow is the cooperative, competitive federalism you're talking about. But Mr. Singh, the PM spoke of a new India in the next 5 years. And would you agree that given our huge regional disparities, the reality is that there is no real one new India that we can talk about? So even if states like UP and Bihar, in fact some of the states in the eastern India, were to become more like the southern and the western states, that itself would transform India much more than anything else earlier. So should we try to do something about reducing, if not ending, regional disparities? And how does one do that while ensuring that it does not become an endless sop to these state governments?
Well, I certainly do believe, having worked also on this area of how to, for instance, mainstream the regions which have lagged behind, particularly some states which have lagged behind, and to seek a greater convergence in terms of the growth patterns among and between regions and among and. I do believe, however, some important initiatives have been taken in that regard. One, I think the fact that the GST is going to really bring many of these things in a transparent way and will really bring some multiplier benefits in terms of the country being more cohesive for a one common market. Many of the high consuming states, like for instance which you mentioned, Bihar and Odisha, would be, in my view, beneficiaries of this.
You brought in the political economy angle, and that brings me to my last question. Is this promise of a new India at 75 or by 2022, it has a subtle subtext which is the continuance of the present government. How critical do you think the continuance of the present political regime is to the realization of this vision? Very quickly, Mr. Singh, and then I'll go to Sajid.
In my view, this is critical. This is the centerpiece of investor confidence. This is the centerpiece of the belief that the current initiatives which have been undertaken, and some of which are on the anvil, and the Prime Minister has already mentioned about 22 as being another important date for really looking and judging at some of these initiatives. I believe that the stability of this government is central to economic growth objectives. I see that this is central to a fusion between sensible politics with sensible economics. I see this, that Mr. Modi has increasingly reached out to people in which development issues are the centerpiece of all his public speeches which you would have seen. And therefore, I think that it is for good reason that this government moves forward to seeing with confidence a renewal of its mandate when it goes for elections.
Sajid, can I draw you in on that? Frankly, I feel in a democracy, a strong opposition, which is sadly missing at the moment, has a great role to play. But even so, what is your take on how important the continuance of the present regime is for the realization of those dreams?
Well, let me answer it more generally, Mythili, to say I think a strong and stable government is a necessary prerequisite, to push through the structural reform we need. But also what's been quite amazing about our democracy in the last 30 years is we've seen a great continuity of reforms across multiple governments. I'm very hopeful of the next 5 years. I think the focus needs to be on what we need to get done. And let me end by just saying 3 or 4 things that we should aspire for in a very concrete fashion between 2017 and 2022. The first is we should not be compromising macroeconomic stability in the pursuit of higher growth. And in addition to that, I think the 2 or 3 things we spoke about, which is double down on the asset resolution process. The sooner we get the deleveraging done, the faster the private investment cycle picks up. Number 3, double increase public investment by expediting the sale of strategic assets and disinvestment. And number 4, keep working on improving the employability of labor.
Well, a number of ideas coming in there from Mr. Singh and Sajid, but I'm afraid we've run out of time completely. So I'll have to end this discussion here. Thank you so much, Sajid and Mr. Singh, for joining me in this discussion and framing a roadmap that the government could possibly try and follow to arrive at that new India. I must confess that I'm still a bit of a non-believer, and I doubt the India that we see in 2022 will be dramatically different from what we have today. But even so, I would be content if it is a better India and for every Indian. And in fact, if the quality of life for Indians in the eastern belt of the country were to catch up with that in the southern and the western states, that itself will make a huge difference. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. In the meantime, if there's any other issue you would like to see discussed in this forum, please do write into us at the email ID you see at the bottom of your screen.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/ETNow.